A truce in trade tensions between the United States and the European Union, at least for now. But has a trade war been averted, and what's the future for trade relations between the world's major economies? My guest today is Pascal Lamy, former head of the World Trade Organization and President Emeritus of the Jacques Delors Foundation. Thank you for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
On France 24. Were you relieved by the agreement that was reached in Washington? Is it a truce for you?
I was more surprised than relieved. I was surprised. I wasn't expecting such a positive outcome. And I'm relieved as long as Mr. Trump doesn't change his mind, which we know sometimes happen. And by the way, happened yesterday in this meeting with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. So I think it's a good ceasefire. And the world economy has welcomed this ceasefire. It's something that addresses concerns on both sides, whether from a bilateral nature, and there will be discussions about reducing transatlantic obstacles to trade in manufacturers, leaving aside services, leaving aside cars, leaving aside agriculture, which is not a real repetition of the previous trade transatlantic partnership, this famous TAFTA, which raised problems in Europe. So it's a much narrower concept of what has to be done to open trade transatlantic. But I think the major step forward is in the recognition by Trump that more disciplines for China have to be negotiated in the WTO. And I think not many people have noticed that last week, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker was in Beijing. He did a trip in Beijing before doing a trip in Washington. And why did he go to Beijing first? To get from the Chinese a signal that they would be ready to enter into a multilateral review of WTO rules. So Juncker did not come empty-handed in Washington. He didn't come with EU concessions, but he came from an opening which he had negotiated with China, which I think is a rather clever way of playing a sort of triangle. EU siding with the US in order to put pressure on China, and EU siding with China in order to put pressure on the US and, in a way, get Trump back to a sort of normal behavior, which, as we know on trade, hadn't been the case for quite a bit of time.
So if the EU didn't make concessions then, does that mean that Donald Trump conceded by agreeing to this ceasefire?
I mean, it's always a temptation to say when there is an agreement, who has conceded more. I mean, the future will tell what will be the outcome of future negotiations. But the fact that you hold fire and you sit on the negotiating table, I think is a positive step forward. Again, provided we are still there a month or 6 months from now.
I'm sensing that you're optimistic that this is going to come to something, this outline agreement, that they will come to some sort of zero tariffs being the goal. Do you think it's achievable?
Yeah, frankly speaking, transatlantic-wise, tariffs are already extremely low. The average, if you leave cars, pickups and trucks, which are heavily tariffed in the US side, if you leave this aside, I mean, the average trade-weighted tariff transatlantic is probably around 2%. That's not a big thing to negotiate. The real area where economies of scale, transatlantic, are available is not in tariff barriers. It's in non-tariff barriers, which is the whole area of norms, precautions, standard, quality, food, safety of toys, lighter, size of bumpers for cars. This is where there are different regulations on both sides, basically for the same reasons, except in some very specific areas like chlorinated poultry or hormone with beef. But there is a huge pit of efficiencies in aligning this precautionary approach. The problem being that, of course, you cannot do that downward. Public opinion would not accept to lower the level. Absolutely. So you have to do it upwards, and it's a bit complex technically. It takes time.
So do you think we're heading towards a kind of a TTIP Mark II light version?
I mean, there's a bit of that, although, again, what has been left aside, cars, agriculture, services, and public procurement, if you remove this from TTIP, you remove most of the reasons why TTIP did not happen in the first place. So it's a sort of ultra-simplified version of TTIP, probably more doable in a, let's say, 2-3 year time frame.
Now, you mentioned that Mr. Juncker and Mr. Trump did say they would work within the WTO, but they also wanted a restructuring, reorganisation, reform of the WTO as well. This is something that we've heard calls for a very long time. What's wrong with the WTO? Why does it cause so much controversy?
I mean, the WTO remains, and what we've seen since a year in looking at how dangerous it is to destabilize WTO. WTO is a sort of collective insurance policy against protectionism. That's why you have to pay a bit from time to time in opening your trade, to keep this insurance policy, which all WTO members have. The reality is that the terms of the policy which you subscribe are today not fit with the world economy. So the rule book, which dates from the 90s, has to be adjusted to a number of developments, starting with China and the huge subsidization capacity it has. The state-run sector in China is roughly 40% of the economy today. This is too large to ensure a fair competition in a global market-based capitalism. Whether we like it or not, that's the system. There are areas in the digital economy which today need to be regulated by the WTO. Issues of data transfer, data localization, data privacy are parameters that heavily influence this raw material of the economy of today and tomorrow, which is data. So this is a series of items which should be negotiated. And the reason why they were not negotiated recently, by the way, had a lot to do with the US. The ones that slowed the WTO negotiating process since 2008, when the members nearly got to concluding the Doha round, which was mandated in the years 2000. I mean, it was already the US. So if this means that the US and Trump are ready to put eggs, US eggs, in the WTO basket, this is good news. I'm not saying we are there, but I'm saying it's a signal in the right direction.
If we have the US and the EU now working together again on trade, or at least on friendlier terms as regards trade, what does that mean for the tensions with China?
I think the EU will be very careful again to remain one of the poles of the triangle. The EU will work with China to move US in the right direction, and they will work with US to move China in the right direction. It's a reasonably good sort of strategic and tactical position, and the reason why the EU can do that is because it's the largest economy on this planet. It's the largest, it's the deepest, for some time, let's say for the next 10 or 20 years, and they have a united trade policy. So when you have the weight and one voice, you can be efficient, and I'm among those who wish that the EU would behave the same way in other areas of international life.
When you look at the events of, this meeting on Wednesday in Washington, are you more confident about the atmosphere around global trade now? It's been pretty poisonous for a couple of months.
Correct, although, as you may know, I've never been among the Cassandra. I personally believe that we've reached a stage of globalization where deglobalization is very costly. And that wasn't true 10, 20, or 30 years ago. The sort of interdependence, the sort of networking of economic systems for production of goods and services are now so intertwined that breaking this is costly. That's probably what led to a change of position of Donald Trump. That's, for instance, in my view, what explains why Brexit is so difficult. There has been a political decision to change the economy, and the economy is resisting because this interdependence has produced efficiencies. So cutting this, shrinking this, will produce inefficiencies, and inefficiencies at the end of the day is a cost for you and me as a consumer.
And do you think that Mr. Trump will stick to the position that he's now agreed with the European Union?
I wouldn't bet my shirt on that, although, as you know, it's very hot in Paris, so today it might be tempting, but nevertheless, I wouldn't do that.
Okay, Pascal Lamy, former president of the head of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and president emeritus of the Jacques Delors Foundation. Thank you very much for speaking.
My pleasure.
On France 24. Thank you to you for watching. Do stay with us. There's more news coming up on France 24.